Welcome to Mystery Archives. There is a heavy, lingering silence that settles over a hospital's critical care unit. It is a place suspended between the living world and whatever comes next. In these sterile rooms, time does not pass in hours or minutes, but in the slow mechanical rhythm of ventilators and the quiet dripping of saline. When a patient reaches the very end of their journey, the veil between our world and the unseen becomes fragile. Tonight, we will walk through those quiet wards together. I have gathered 5 true stories of the unexplainable, the unseen, and the restless entities that walk the halls when the living look away. So, find a comfortable position. Close your eyes. Let your breathing match the slow, steady rhythm of the dark, and let the quiet mysteries of the night wash over you. Our first story begins in the hushed, sterile environment of a modern critical care unit. For 3 years, I worked the day shifts in the CCU. My days were entirely devoted to tending to patients who were slowly, inevitably, reaching the end of their lives. You learn to detach yourself from the constant presence of death, but you never truly get used to the heavy atmosphere it leaves behind. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was alone in room 7, standing watch over a deeply sedated patient. The room was bathed in a dim, artificial twilight. The heavy door was pulled mostly shut, muffling the distant, echoing chatter of the nurses stationed down the long hallway. Inside the room, the only sound was the slow, mechanical rise and fall of my patient's chest, aided by the steady, hypnotic hiss of the life support machines. I turned my back to the bed and slowly approached the tall equipment cart in the corner of the room to log some routine vitals. The cart was out of arm's reach of the bed. I was the only conscious, moving person within that enclosed space. As I stood there, staring at the blank, sleeping monitor of the medical console, something impossible happened right in front of my eyes. A single touchscreen button on the smooth glass interface depressed itself. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a malfunction of pixels. The glass screen physically registered a deliberate, localized pressure. I heard the sharp, distinct tap of a fingernail striking the glass, followed instantly by the soft, electronic ring of the machine accepting the command. The screen woke from its slumber, flooding the dim corner of the room with a cold, pale blue light that washed over my face. I stood there, completely frozen. My hands hovered over my clipboard. My brain scrambled to find a logical explanation for how a physical touch could manifest in a space filled only with empty air. I stared at the glowing blue square on the monitor, my breath caught in my throat. And then, it happened again. Right before my wide eyes, the exact same button sank silently inward under the weight of an unseen touch. It unselected whatever choice it had just made. The machine chimed softly once more, and the blue light vanished, plunging the corner of the room back into the dim, heavy gray shadows. A wave of profound, freezing terror raced down my spine. The air around me suddenly felt impossibly crowded. I didn't run, and I didn't scream, but I backed out of room 7 with my heart pounding against my ribs, unable to shake the feeling that I had just interrupted someone, or something, looking over the medical charts. I tried to bury the memory. I tried to convince myself it was just a strange electrical anomaly. But the hospital wasn't finished with me. Exactly 1 week later, my shift had just ended. The evening transition had settled down, and the main hallway was mostly deserted. I was walking alone toward the locker rooms. The long corridor was silent, my footsteps muffled by the thin, industrial carpet strips that lined the baseboards. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed a low, monotonous drone. As I walked past the closed doors of the empty patient bays, a voice sliced through the quiet. "Hey!" It was a whisper, raspy and low, coming from directly behind my right shoulder. The breath of the word felt close enough to stir the hair on the back of my neck. I flinched, but my rational mind took over. I assumed I hadn't heard a coworker trailing at a distance behind me. I didn't turn around. I simply kept my eyes forward and quickened my pace slightly, eager to just go home. But then, the voice spoke again. This time, it didn't just whisper a greeting. It called my own name. The pronunciation was crystal clear, deliberate, and it came from the exact same spot, hovering just inches behind my shoulder. My blood ran completely cold. I stopped dead in my tracks and spun around quickly, fully expecting to see a familiar doctor or a fellow nurse playing a cruel joke. I was completely alone. The long corridor stretched out behind me, utterly and completely empty. There was nowhere to hide. No open doors, no intersecting hallways. Just the dim wall lights, which chose that exact moment to flicker, casting long, wavering shadows across the empty space. I realized then that whatever had touched the screen in room 7 had followed me out into the hall. To this day, I know with absolute certainty that the wards of that hospital are shared by things we cannot see. But the entities that wander the corridors don't just mimic our voices or touch our machines. Sometimes, they bring the sounds of their deepest sorrows back with them from the other side. Let us walk now to a quiet maternity ward, where an exhausted pediatrician is about to hear a cry that should not exist. My children's pediatrician is usually a very chatty, jovial man. Appointments with him usually run long because of his warm, talkative nature. But on one particular visit, when I took my child in for a routine checkup and vaccinations, the atmosphere in his small clinic felt incredibly heavy. When I jokingly asked him why he looked so incredibly exhausted, his usual warm smile completely vanished. He looked away, staring blankly at the wall of his own brightly lit office. His voice dropped to a near whisper. He asked me, very seriously, if I believed there was something waiting for us after death. I nodded slowly. He sighed, rubbing his tired eyes, and confided in me a secret he swore he wouldn't tell any other patient. He had been called in at 3 o'clock that very morning for a severe emergency. It was an urgent delivery, and he had to perform a C-section to try and save a baby in distress. But despite his frantic efforts, the complications were simply too severe. The child did not make it. I offered my deepest condolences, the weight of his words hanging in the quiet room. He nodded slowly, continuing his story. After doing everything he could for the grieving mother, the adrenaline finally left his body, leaving behind a crushing, hollow exhaustion. Operating on barely 3 hours of sleep, he dragged himself to the small, dimly lit break room just off the surgical floor. The hospital was deep in that still, breathless hour before dawn. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, staring blankly at the linoleum floor. And then, cutting through the absolute silence of the empty surgical wing, he heard it. It was the unmistakable, sharp wail of a newborn baby crying. The sound was echoing out from the exact operating theater he had just left. A jolt of desperate hope shot through his exhausted veins. He assumed the impossible, that the baby had somehow miraculously drawn breath, that they had been wrong about its passing. He dropped his coffee and rushed back out into the hall. But when he pushed open the heavy doors to the operating theater, the room was completely dark. It was entirely empty. The mother, the nurses, the equipment, everyone had already been wheeled out and relocated. He stood alone in the sterile, quiet space, frantically scanning the corners, looking for any sign of a child. But there was nothing. Just the gleaming stainless steel tables and the cold, sanitized air. The pediatric ward, where the healthy newborns were kept, was located 2 entirely different floors down. The surgical room was heavily soundproofed and completely isolated. Standing there in the dark, the exhausted doctor realized he hadn't heard a living child. He wondered, with a deep, lingering chill, if he had just heard the spirit of that newborn baby giving its very first and very final cries, before quietly moving on into the dark. That experience left him with a profound sense of dread, forever changing how he viewed the quiet, empty corridors of the hospital he worked in every single day. The profound sadness of a maternity ward can leave an indelible mark on the walls. But sometimes, the supernatural occurrences surrounding childbirth aren't just echoes of sorrow. Sometimes, the unseen entities of the hospital decide to pitch in and make their presence known in the most bizarre, undeniable ways. Let us travel back to another hospital waiting room, where an 11-year-old boy is about to witness an invisible hand. The miracle of life is often surrounded by chaos, bright lights, and the frantic energy of a medical team. But in the quiet hours just before a birth, the veil between our world and the unseen becomes notoriously thin. Let us travel back to a dimly lit maternity ward, where an 11-year-old boy is about to witness an invisible hand preparing for the arrival of his little brother. My little brother chose the absolute quietest hour of the night to make his grand entrance, deciding to be born right at the crack of dawn. I was 11 years old at the time, completely exhausted, and sprawling irritably on one of those thin blue gym mats the hospital had dragged into the room as a makeshift cot. I can still remember the strange, rubbery texture of the mat sticking to my skin, and the way the room hummed with a heavy, anxious tension. Through my half-open eyes, I watched the care team bustling around, pushing a heavy stainless steel cart loaded with medical equipment into the dim room. The head nurse announced in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone that they were about to break my mother's water. This prompted the entire medical team to step away toward the deep porcelain sink basin mounted on the wall near the door. It was an older hospital, and the sink had those vintage, oversized wing-shaped handles. They were made of heavy brushed metal, clearly labeled hot and cold, designed so doctors could quickly activate the water with their elbows during busy surgical shifts. I sat up groggily on my blue mat, with my dad positioned right behind me, silently watching the team assemble. The room was filled with the soft rustle of sterile drapes and the snap of rubber gloves. But before any of the doctors or nurses could even reach the sink, the heavy brushed metal handle for the cold water began to slowly turn entirely on its own. It moved with a long, drawn-out metallic creak that echoed over the quiet hum of the room. A steady, heavy stream of freezing water began gushing into the porcelain basin. My jaw practically hit the floor, and I could feel my dad freeze completely solid right beside me. We were both paralyzed in slack-jawed awe, staring at the running water, waiting in the heavy silence to see what would happen next. Mounted low on the tiled backsplash right next to the running faucet was a manual push-lever soap dispenser. As we stared, the heavy plastic lever slowly depressed itself inward, exactly as if it were being pumped by the invisible elbow of a phantom doctor scrubbing in for surgery. A thick, frothy dollop of pink liquid soap squirted out of the nozzle, splattering messily onto the wet floor below with a slippery, echoing splat. The cold water ran strong for another few seconds, swirling the leftover soap into frothy edges down the drain. And then, methodically and deliberately, the heavy metal handle rotated backward, counterclockwise, shutting the water off with a firm, solid click. It was exactly as if someone had calmly finished washing their hands and simply stepped away into thin air. No human figure occupied that space. Yet, right at that very moment, the wall-mounted paper towel dispenser kicked alive. Its red motion sensor light blinked on completely unprompted in the dark. The machine whirred, feeding a single crisp white sheet of paper towel down toward the floor. And then, right before our eyes, something completely unseen violently ripped the towel loose in midair, sending the torn paper drifting gently down to the wet tiles like a feather caught in a slow breeze. The stunned, heavy silence of the room was finally broken by my dad. In a hoarse, trembling whisper, he asked what the hell everyone had just seen. I chimed in instantly, my eyes wide with terror, confirming that I had seen it too. But the most chilling part of that night wasn't the invisible hands washing at the sink. It was the reaction of the medical staff. One of the nurses simply glanced over her shoulder, let out a soft chuckle and casually stated that it looked like their resident ghost was just pitching in to help deliver my little brother. They didn't panic. They didn't run. They simply shooed me out into the waiting area and wheeled my mother into position, entirely unbothered by the phantom in the room. When we pressed them later about why they were so incredibly calm about floating soap and faucets turning themselves on, they just shrugged. "It's a hospital," they replied, as if that explained everything. When the living are that calm about the dead walking among them, you realize that some hospitals are far more haunted than we could ever imagine. Let us descend now into the sterile, isolated corridors of the blood bank, where a young lab technician is about to realize that her newest colleague hasn't had a heartbeat in months. Our fourth story takes us deep into the subterranean levels of an old city hospital, where the air is eternally chilled and the fluorescent lights hum a low, monotonous drone. It was here, in the isolated blood bank, that a young lab technician was about to learn that some doctors never truly clock out for the night. She was relatively new to the facility, working a quiet, solitary shift in the deepest part of the building. The blood bank was situated at the very back of the lab, a sterile, cold environment filled with nothing but refrigerators, rows of testing supplies, and liters of stored blood keeping her company. She was deeply focused on an urgent stack of tests piled high on the counter before her. The room was filled with the rhythmic, heavy whir of centrifuges spinning in the background, a mechanical lullaby that usually helped her concentrate. But as she carefully handled the labeled slides and glass tubes, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Out of nowhere, she felt a distinct, primal prickling sensation wash over her. It was the heavy, undeniable feeling of someone watching her intently from just a few feet away. She glanced up quickly from her work, expecting to see a colleague needing assistance. Instead, she spotted an older, bald man standing completely silently in the dim doorway. His expression was utterly calm, but entirely unreadable, casting a pale shadow under the flickering overhead lights. He wore a pristine white lab coat, standing perfectly still, with one hand tucked casually inside his pocket. The young technician, completely absorbed in her towering workload and known for her no-nonsense attitude, didn't feel a surge of supernatural dread. She just felt irritation at the interruption. Without hesitating, she glared at the quiet figure and yelled sharply, "Not now, I'm busy." The man's reaction was chillingly devoid of emotion. Without breaking stride, without changing his unreadable expression, and without even looking twice at her, he turned smoothly on his heels. He glided out into the linoleum hallway without uttering a single word, his footsteps making absolutely no sound as he vanished into the dark. Once she had finally poured through the last of her urgent work and caught her breath, the strange, silent encounter began to gnaw at her. She stepped out into the main, brightly lit lab area to ask the senior techs about the older doctor who had poked his head into her isolated section, right in the middle of a rush. When she perfectly described his exact appearance, the pale, bald head, the older features, and his distinct, rigid posture with one hand permanently tucked inside his lab coat, the color slowly drained from her colleagues' faces. They all nodded knowingly, confirming that it was definitely a specific doctor they all remembered. But there was one terrifying detail. That particular doctor had suffered a massive heart attack and passed away months before she had ever set foot in the building. The senior staff quietly explained that the phantom physician was a permanent fixture in the shadows of the hospital. Technicians often caught fleeting glimpses of him, wandering the long, quiet lab corridors, or lingering silently near the blood bank. He was always seen frozen in that same signature pose, looking exactly like he was still making his usual nightly rounds to check on the progress of the lab. The longer-tenured staff firmly believed that his spirit simply didn't realize he had died, and so he kept drifting back into his old, demanding routine out of pure, restless habit. To this day, that technician still looks back on the event, realizing she had unknowingly scolded a ghost and told him to let her do her job in peace. But while some spirits wander the halls quietly out of habit, others are far more aware of their surroundings, and they are desperate to pull the living into the dark with them. Let us travel now to the shadowy confines of room 412, where a night nurse is about to answer a call light that should never have been triggered. Our final story of the night brings us to a quiet, long-term care ward. The night shift is usually a time of deep, uninterrupted routine, governed by the slow ticking of the clock and the occasional soft chime of a patient needing water or pain medication. But on this particular night, the routine was broken early by the passing of an elderly patient named Mr. Garrow. He had occupied room 412 at the very end of the hall for several weeks. He was a difficult man, known for his harsh, raspy voice and his constant, demanding complaints. When he finally succumbed to his illness shortly after midnight, the nursing staff felt a heavy, unspoken sense of relief mixed with the usual solemnity of death. Following standard procedure, the attending nurse meticulously prepared his body. She washed him, wrapped him, and securely tied the standard identification tag around his pale toe. The orderlies then arrived, quietly wheeling Mr. Garrow's covered form down the long, empty elevator shaft to the basement morgue. Room 412 was immediately stripped of its linens. The mattress was wiped down, the floors were sanitized, and the heavy door was pulled shut, leaving the room completely dark and entirely empty. Around 3 a.m., the ward had settled into a thick, heavy silence. The nurse was sitting at the brightly lit central station, quietly catching up on her charting. Suddenly, the silence was pierced by a sharp electronic chime. She looked up at the main console. A blinking red light illuminated the board. It was the emergency call button, and it was coming directly from room 412. Assuming it was simply a wiring glitch or a short circuit caused by the recent aggressive cleaning, she let out a tired sigh. She stood up, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum, and walked down the long, dim corridor toward the end of the hall. She pushed open the heavy door to 412. The room was pitch black, smelling strongly of industrial bleach and stale, cold air. She didn't bother turning on the main overhead lights. She simply reached over to the wall panel, hit the reset switch to kill the blinking red call light, and pulled the door shut behind her. She walked back to the desk and sat down. Less than 5 minutes later, the console chimed again. The red light for room 412 was flashing frantically. A cold knot of unease began to form in the pit of her stomach. The call buttons in this hospital were physical switches. They required deliberate downward pressure to activate. They didn't just turn themselves on. She stood up again, her heart beating a slightly faster rhythm against her ribs. She walked back down the quiet hall, her eyes fixed on the closed door of 412. This time, when she pushed the door open, the heavy, unnatural cold of the room seemed to spill out into the hallway, wrapping around her ankles. She stepped entirely into the dark room, reaching for the main light switch. But before her fingers could find the plastic panel, a sound stopped her dead in her tracks. It came from the ensuite bathroom. The bathroom door was cracked open just an inch, revealing a sliver of absolute, impenetrable darkness. From deep within that pitch-black space, a voice drifted out. It was a dry, raspy, rattling whisper that sounded like dead leaves scraping against concrete. It was a voice she had heard complaining 1,000 times before. It was Mr. Garrow. And from the suffocating darkness of that empty bathroom, the raspy voice slowly, agonizingly whispered, "You tied the toe tag too tight." The nurse stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from her face. She didn't turn on the light. She didn't investigate the bathroom. She slowly, mechanically backed out of the room, her trembling hands pulling the heavy door shut until the latch clicked into place. She walked back to the nurse's station, sat down in her chair, and stared at the wall, refusing to answer another call light from that wing for the rest of the night. Some patients, it seems, always have one final complaint. The hospital corridors have finally fallen completely silent. The night shift log is closed, and the shadows have fully retreated to the corners of the empty wards. If these stories from Mystery Archives have guided you safely through the dark tonight, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can meet again when the lights go out. But for now, the darkness belongs entirely to you. There is nothing left to fear. The monitors are quiet, the doors are locked, and it is time to rest. Close your eyes, breathe in the quiet, and sleep well.